In the depths beneath the Reich Chancellery garden, 30 feet below the rubble of a dying city, time was running out. The date was April 30th, 1945. Above ground, Soviet artillery shells rained down on Berlin with merciless precision. Below, in the concrete maze known as the Führerbunker, the man who had plunged the world into its most devastating war was spending his final hours on Earth. Among the handful of people trapped in that underground tomb was a young woman named Traudl Junge. She was 25 years old. She had been hired as a secretary, and in the final hours before Adolf Hitler's death, she would witness something that historians would debate for decades to come. What did Hitler say in those last moments? What thoughts consumed the mind of a dictator facing total defeat? What secrets, confessions, or delusions emerged when there was nothing left to lose? This is the story of those final conversations, a story drawn from the testimony of those who survived, a story that reveals not heroism or redemption, but the collapse of a regime built on hatred and the mundane reality of evil's final chapter. To understand what happened in that bunker, we must first understand how Hitler arrived at this moment of absolute ruin. By April 1945, the Third Reich existed only on maps that were increasingly meaningless. The empire that Hitler had boasted would last 1,000 years was crumbling after just 12. The Allied forces were closing in from all directions. American and British troops had crossed the Rhine. Soviet armies, driven by both military strategy and a hunger for vengeance, were fighting street by street through Berlin itself. The war Hitler had started with such confidence in 1939 had metastasized into a global catastrophe. Tens of millions were dead. Cities lay in ruins across Europe. The systematic genocide Hitler had orchestrated, the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed undesirable, was being revealed to a horrified world as concentration camps were liberated. By mid-April, Hitler had retreated to the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in central Berlin. This was not a strategic withdrawal. This was a man with nowhere left to go. The bunker complex consisted of 2 levels, the upper Vorbunker and the deeper Führerbunker, connected by a spiral staircase. The walls were thick concrete, designed to withstand bombing, but they could not withstand the inevitable. The atmosphere inside was suffocating, both literally and psychologically. Ventilation was poor. The constant rumble of artillery created an unending tremor. Diesel generators hummed in the background. The smell of concrete dust, sweat, and anxiety permeated everything. This was a tomb for the living, and everyone inside knew it. Hitler's inner circle had shrunk dramatically. Many high-ranking Nazis had fled Berlin, seeking escape routes to the south or attempting to negotiate separate peace deals. Those who remained did so out of loyalty, fear, or simply because they had nowhere else to go. Among them were Joseph Goebbels, propaganda minister and perhaps Hitler's most devoted follower, Martin Bormann, the head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, and a rotating cast of military officers delivering increasingly desperate situation reports. And then there were the secretaries, the typists, the staff who had been part of Hitler's administrative machinery and now found themselves trapped in history's final act. Traudl Junge, born as Gertraud Humps in Munich in 1920. She came of age as the Nazi regime consolidated its power. Like many young Germans, she had been shaped by the propaganda that surrounded her. She was not a party ideologue. She was not involved in policy or military strategy. She was, by her own later admission, apolitical and naive, caught up in the machinery of a system she did not fully understand or question. In 1942, at the age of 22, Junge applied for a position as a secretary in Hitler's office. She was one of several candidates interviewed for the role. Hitler himself conducted the final interview, a typing test in which the candidates transcribed his dictation. Junge was nervous, making several mistakes, but she was ultimately selected for the position. For nearly 3 years, she worked in close proximity to Hitler. She typed his letters, his speeches, his orders. She took dictation during meetings. She traveled with him to various headquarters. In her later recollections, she described a man who could be charming in private, who was fond of dogs, and enjoyed late-night conversations about art and architecture. But she also witnessed the paranoia, the rages, the increasing detachment from reality. As the war turned against Germany, Junge observed Hitler's physical and mental deterioration. The confident leader she had first met in 1942 became a hunched, trembling figure by 1945. His left hand shook uncontrollably, possibly due to Parkinson's disease. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor. He shuffled rather than walked. He required thick glasses to read documents. But he still commanded absolute authority over those around him, and in the final days he would call upon Junge to perform one last duty. Junge's testimony is crucial to understanding Hitler's final hours, but it must be approached with appropriate caution. Memory is fallible, especially under extreme stress. Junge herself later acknowledged that the trauma of those days may have affected her recollection. Additionally, as someone who served the regime, her perspective carries certain limitations and biases. Nevertheless, her accounts, corroborated where possible by other witnesses, provide our most detailed window into those final moments. After the war, Junge struggled with guilt over her role in the Nazi regime. She gave extensive interviews, including in the powerful documentary Blind Spot, filmed shortly before her death in 2002. In these interviews, she emphasized that ignorance was not an excuse, that she should have questioned more, should have seen what was happening around her. Her testimony about Hitler's final hours emerges from this complex legacy. It is neither a justification nor an apology. It is simply what she remembered witnessing in that bunker beneath Berlin. As April 1945 progressed, the situation reports delivered to Hitler became increasingly catastrophic. The Soviet forces had encircled Berlin. House-to-house fighting was taking place mere blocks from the Reich Chancellery. The sound of machine gun fire could be heard even in the depths of the bunker. Hitler's daily military conferences became exercises in delusion. Colored pins on maps represented army units that no longer existed. Plans were drawn up for counterattacks that could never be launched. Generals who dared to report the truth faced accusations of defeatism or treason. On April 20th, Hitler celebrated his 56th birthday in the bunker. It was a grim affair. Well-wishers came to pay their respects, but the atmosphere was funereal. Many of Hitler's closest associates used the occasion to urge him to leave Berlin, to fly south to the Alpine Redoubt, where they claimed the fight could continue. Hitler refused. He would remain in Berlin, he declared. He would direct the defense of the capital. In reality, there was no defense left to direct. On April 22nd came the breaking point. During a military conference, Hitler learned that an SS unit he had been counting on for the defense of Berlin had failed to attack. According to witnesses, he erupted in one of his most violent rages. He screamed that he had been betrayed, that everyone had lied to him, that the German people had proven themselves unworthy of his leadership. For nearly an hour he ranted, his voice echoing through the bunker corridors. Then suddenly the rage subsided into something else, a kind of exhausted resignation. Hitler announced that he would stay in Berlin until the end. He would not flee. He would not surrender. He would take his own life rather than fall into Soviet hands. This decision set in motion the final sequence of events. If Hitler was going to die, there were arrangements to be made. There were documents to prepare. There were final statements to record. And there was one more marriage to conduct. On April 28th, Soviet forces were within a quarter-mile of the Reich Chancellery. The end was now measured in hours, perhaps days at most. In the early morning hours of April 29th, Hitler made a decision that surprised even those closest to him. He would marry his longtime companion, Eva Braun. Braun had been Hitler's partner for over a decade, but their relationship had been kept largely secret from the German public. She had insisted on joining him in the bunker, refusing offers to evacuate to safety. Now, with death imminent, Hitler agreed to the ceremony she had long desired. A minor city official was found, brought to the bunker, and instructed to perform a civil ceremony. The affair was brief and surreal. Afterward, there was a small wedding breakfast with champagne. Witnesses described the atmosphere as simultaneously celebratory and macabre, toasting to newlyweds who would be dead within hours. But Hitler's primary focus that day was not celebration. It was documentation. He wanted his version of events recorded for history. He wanted to explain his actions, to assign blame for Germany's defeat, and to issue final instructions to whatever remained of the German state. This is where Traudl Junge enters the final chapter of the story. In the late evening of April 29th, Hitler summoned Junge to his private study. He wanted to dictate two documents, his personal will and his political testament. For the next several hours, Junge sat at her typewriter while Hitler spoke. The personal will was relatively brief. It addressed the disposition of his personal effects, his art collection, and his decision to marry Eva Braun. It stated his intention to choose death rather than capitulation, and his wish that their bodies be cremated. The political testament was longer and more revealing. In it, Hitler attempted to shape the historical narrative. He denied responsibility for starting the war, instead blaming international Jewish conspiracies and the weakness of other nations. He expelled Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler from the Nazi Party for their attempts to negotiate separate peace deals, acts he considered treasonous. He appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor as head of state and named a new government cabinet. Throughout the dictation, Junge later recalled, Hitler's voice was often flat and monotonous, but occasionally flared with anger when discussing betrayals. He showed no remorse for the suffering he had caused, no acknowledgement of the millions dead, no acceptance of responsibility. Instead, he portrayed himself as a victim, a leader betrayed by his subordinates and misunderstood by history. When the dictation was finished around 4 a.m, Hitler signed both documents. Copies were made. Couriers were designated to attempt to carry these testaments out of the besieged city. Most would not succeed, but enough copies survived to ensure Hitler's final words were preserved. But Junge's service was not yet complete. Over the next several hours, as April 30th dawned, there would be further conversations, further moments of witnessing that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The exact sequence and content of Hitler's final conversations remain subject to some historical uncertainty. Different witnesses recalled different interactions. The chaos and stress of the situation affected everyone's memory. However, from Junge's testimony and accounts from others present, we can reconstruct the general nature of those final exchanges. After completing the dictation of his testaments, Hitler did not sleep. Instead, he made rounds of the bunker, saying farewell to staff members. These interactions were described as formal, almost ceremonial. He shook hands, thanked people for their service, and distributed cyanide capsules to those who wished to avoid capture by Soviet forces. Junge recalled that Hitler's demeanor during these farewells was eerily calm. The rage and paranoia that had characterized previous days seemed to have burned out, replaced by a kind of resigned determination. He knew what was coming. He had made his decision. All that remained was to carry it out. At some point during the morning of April 30th, Hitler spoke with Junge about more personal matters. In her later interviews, she described a conversation in which he seemed, briefly, to show something resembling self-reflection, though it fell far short of genuine remorse or accountability. He spoke about his health, acknowledging that he was failing physically. He mentioned that he did not want to become a spectacle, to be paraded as a prisoner or displayed as a trophy. The fate of Mussolini, whose corpse had been hung upside down in Milan just days earlier, haunted him. He was determined to avoid that humiliation. Hitler also spoke about his regrets regarding the war's conduct, though not its underlying aims or ideology. He blamed his generals for various military failures. He suggested that if certain decisions had been made differently, if certain people had not betrayed him, victory might still have been possible. This was delusional thinking, but it revealed his inability to grasp the fundamentally flawed nature of his entire endeavor. According to Junge, Hitler never expressed remorse for the Holocaust or the suffering inflicted on civilian populations. These topics simply did not arise in their conversations. Either he felt no need to address them, or he considered them justified components of his ideological struggle. This absence of moral reckoning is perhaps the most chilling aspect of his final hours. Hitler did speak about Germany's future. He expressed hope that the German people would eventually understand his vision and vindicate his actions. He spoke as if his legacy was assured, as if history would judge him favorably. This was not the reflection of a man confronting the enormity of his crimes, but rather someone still trapped in his own mythology. Around midday on April 30th, Hitler took his lunch. He ate quietly with his secretaries and his vegetarian cook. The meal was simple, spaghetti with a light sauce. Conversation was minimal. The sound of artillery was continuous now, so close that the bunker structure itself vibrated. After lunch, Hitler and Eva Braun retired to their private quarters. They said their final goodbyes to the staff. Junge later described this farewell as brief and emotionless. Hitler shook her hand. There were no dramatic final words, no grand pronouncements, just a simple acknowledgement, and then he turned away. What was said in those private quarters between Hitler and Eva Braun in their final moments, no one knows. They were alone, but the outcome was inevitable. At approximately 3:30 p.m. on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun ended their lives in Hitler's private study. He used a pistol. She took cyanide. The sound of the gunshot was heard by those waiting anxiously outside. After a brief, tense pause, Martin Bormann, Joseph Goebbels, and Hitler's valet, Heinz Linge, entered the room. They found the bodies seated together on a small sofa. The scene was described as surprisingly mundane. There was blood, but less than might be expected. Eva Braun had slumped to the side. Hitler sat with the pistol near his feet. The bodies were carried up the stairs to the Reich Chancellery garden. Gasoline was poured over them. They were set aflame in a makeshift pyre, while Soviet shells continued to fall nearby. The cremation was incomplete, hastily conducted amid the ongoing battle. Later, Soviet forces would discover the partially burned remains, leading to decades of speculation and Cold War propaganda about Hitler's fate. For Traudl Junge and the others remaining in the bunker, Hitler's death did not bring immediate relief. They were still trapped. The Soviet forces were literally overhead. The choice was surrender or suicide. Over the next day, the bunker population fragmented. Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda made the decision to take their own lives and those of their 6 children. This murder-suicide, carried out on the evening of May 1st, represented another horrific chapter in the bunker's final hours. The children, aged 4 to 12, were poisoned while sleeping. Others attempted escape. Small groups tried to break through Soviet lines under cover of darkness. Some succeeded. Many were captured or killed. Traudl Junge was among those who attempted escape. She survived the breakout, was eventually captured by Soviet forces, and after a period of detention was released to make her way back to Bavaria. In the immediate aftermath of the war, there was confusion about Hitler's fate. The Soviet Union initially denied having found his remains, fueling conspiracy theories that he had escaped. It would take years before the full story emerged from multiple witness testimonies and forensic evidence. Traudl Junge was interrogated by both Soviet and later American authorities. Her testimony about Hitler's final hours became a crucial historical source. Over the following decades, she was interviewed numerous times by historians, journalists, and documentary filmmakers. For many years, Junge struggled with her role in the Nazi regime. In interviews from the 1940s and 1950s, she often portrayed herself primarily as a victim of circumstances, someone who had been young and naive, who had not understood what was truly happening. But as she aged, her perspective evolved. The turning point came when she learned about Sophie Scholl, a resistance fighter who had been executed by the Nazis in 1943. Scholl was the same age as Junge and had lived in the same city. Yet Scholl had recognized the evil of the regime and had acted against it. This realization haunted Junge. She came to believe that youth and ignorance were not sufficient excuses. In her final interviews, recorded for the documentary Blind Spot in 2001, Junge spoke with remarkable candor about her guilt and her failure to question what was happening around her. She acknowledged that she had chosen not to see, not to ask difficult questions, because it was easier and more comfortable. She had been complicit through her willingness to serve without moral reflection. This evolution in Junge's testimony raises important questions about memory, guilt, and historical witness. Her accounts of the bunker's final hours remained relatively consistent across decades, but her interpretation of their meaning changed dramatically. She went from seeing herself as a mere observer to acknowledging her participation in a criminal system. Her testimony reminds us that history is not just recorded in official documents, but in the memories of those who lived through events. And those memories are shaped not only by what happened, but by decades of subsequent reflection, guilt, and changing understanding. Historians have spent nearly 80 years analyzing the final days of the Third Reich and attempting to understand what Hitler's final actions and words reveal about his character and ideology. One key observation is the absence of any genuine self-reflection or moral reckoning in Hitler's final statements. His political testament and his conversations with staff members show a man who remained trapped in his ideological worldview until the very end. He blamed others for Germany's defeat. He maintained his anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. He showed no empathy for the millions who had died as a result of his decisions. This lack of remorse tells us something important about the nature of totalitarian ideology. Hitler was not simply a cynical politician who manipulated beliefs for power. He was a true believer in his own mythology. He had convinced himself that he was acting in service of a higher racial and historical destiny. This self-deception allowed him to order mass murder without experiencing moral conflict. The mundane nature of Hitler's final hours also deserves attention. There were no grand dramatic gestures, no philosophical soliloquies, no moments of tragic recognition as you might find in classical drama. Instead, there were administrative documents, brief farewells, and a quiet suicide. The banality of these final acts reflects what philosopher Hannah Arendt would later term the banality of evil, the way that enormous crimes can be committed through bureaucratic process and by people who see themselves as simply doing their duty. Hitler's choice to marry Eva Braun hours before their joint suicide has been interpreted in various ways. Some see it as a final gesture of bourgeois respectability, a desire to legitimate their relationship in death. Others view it as part of Hitler's need to control every aspect of his final chapter, to script his own ending down to the last detail. The decision to take his own life rather than face capture represents a final act of control in a situation where he had lost control over everything else. It denied his enemies the satisfaction of trying him for his crimes. It allowed him to attempt to shape his legacy through his final testaments. And it reflected his characteristic preference for dramatic gestures over the messy reality of accountability. From a historical perspective, the testimony of people like Traudl Junge provides invaluable detail about the final days of the Nazi regime, but it must be used carefully. Personal testimony is subject to memory errors, bias, and the influence of subsequent knowledge. Historians must corroborate witness accounts with documentary evidence, physical evidence, and multiple independent testimonies. The fact that Junge's core account has remained consistent across many interviews and has been corroborated by other surviving witnesses lends it credibility. But the meaning and interpretation of what she witnessed continues to evolve as historical understanding deepens. What can we learn from studying Hitler's final hours and the testimony of those who witnessed them? First, these events remind us that historical monsters are not supernatural beings. They are human with all the mundanity that implies. Hitler ate meals, had secretaries, maintained daily routines, even as he directed genocidal policies. Understanding this ordinariness is crucial to recognizing how such evil can emerge and be sustained within normal-seeming bureaucratic structures. Second, the testimony of people like Traudl Junge illustrates the moral complexity of complicity. She was not a concentration camp guard. She did not personally kill anyone. But she served a regime that was committing mass murder, and she chose not to question or resist. Her later struggle with guilt shows the long-term consequences of moral passivity in the face of injustice. Third, Hitler's final statements, with their complete absence of remorse or accountability, demonstrate how ideology can blind people to the consequences of their actions. He died as he had lived, committed to a worldview that justified unlimited violence in service of racial supremacy. This was not insanity. It was the logical conclusion of the beliefs he had espoused for decades. Fourth, the preservation and study of testimony from this era serves an essential function. As the last direct witnesses to these events pass away, we are left with their recorded memories and the documentary evidence they created. Future generations will not be able to interview someone who was actually there. They will depend on the historical record we preserve and interpret today. Finally, these events underscore the importance of vigilance against authoritarianism in all its forms. The Nazi regime did not emerge overnight. It rose through a combination of economic crisis, political failure, clever propaganda, and the willingness of ordinary people to go along, to not ask questions, to prioritize personal security over moral responsibility. The bunker beneath Berlin was both a literal and metaphorical dead end. It was the final chapter of a regime that had promised greatness and delivered catastrophe. Everyone trapped in that concrete tomb had made choices that led them there. Some were more culpable than others, but all were caught in the consequences of decisions made over many years. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, in a small room 30 feet underground, the most destructive dictatorship in human history came to an ignominious end. There were no final revelations, no dramatic redemption, no historical vindication. Just two people, surrounded by concrete walls and the distant thunder of artillery, choosing death over accountability. Traudl Junge lived for another 57 years after that day. She carried the memories of what she witnessed and the guilt of her participation until her death in 2002. Her testimony, complicated as it is, remains one of our most detailed sources for those final hours. It is neither complete nor entirely objective, but it is what we have, one person's recollection of bearing witness to history's darkest chapter reaching its conclusion. The story of Hitler's final conversations is not ultimately about him. It is about what happens when people stop asking moral questions, when ideology replaces humanity, when loyalty to a leader supersedes loyalty to truth and justice. It is about the consequences of choices made by millions of individuals who decided to follow, to obey, to serve without sufficiently questioning where they were being led. The ruins of the Führerbunker still exist beneath Berlin, though much of it has been sealed or buried. The site is deliberately unmarked, refusing to become a shrine or destination. This is appropriate. There is nothing there worth commemorating, only lessons worth remembering. The voices of those who were there, like Junge, have mostly fallen silent now. But their testimony remains, preserved in archives and documentaries, available to anyone willing to engage with this difficult history. We study these events not to glorify or sensationalize them, but to understand how they happened and to ensure they never happen again. In the end, what Hitler told his secretary and others in his final hours was less important than what he did in the years leading up to those final hours. The machinery of genocide, the launching of total war, the systematic destruction of democratic institutions, the cultivation of hatred and violence as political tools. These were the actions that defined his legacy and condemned millions to suffering and death. The final conversations in the bunker were simply the last notes of a symphony of destruction. They reveal a mind unchanged, unrepentant, and still devoted to the very beliefs that had caused such devastation. They remind us that evil does not always announce itself with horns and thunder. Sometimes it speaks in quiet tones in underground rooms, issuing orders, dictating testaments, saying farewell before one last act of control. History remembers. The witnesses spoke, and their testimony stands as both record and warning. This happened, this was real, and we must never allow ourselves to forget what human beings are capable of when they abandon moral judgment in service of ideology and power. The bunker is silent now, but the lessons of those final hours continue to echo across the decades, asking each generation the same question that Junge eventually asked herself. When confronted with injustice, with cruelty, with the machinery of evil in operation, will you choose to see? Will you choose to question? Will you choose to resist? The answer to that question remains, as always, up to us. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more untold stories from history. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.